Hi everybody, Professor Cruz here with some responses to our Week 3 Ethics in Action case studies as we wrap up our class and think about some of the important final topics in this last week, focused on issues of racial justice and histories of racial struggles in this country. So we started out with our case studies looking at the Black Lives Matter movement and questions of racial justice. And overall, a majority of you expressed a general concern about the sort of growing threat of armed white supremacists and felt that there needed to be some kind of a strong reaction from our government. And a few specific possible responses people mentioned that I wanted to highlight. One of them included, considering whether we should ban rallies of white supremacist groups like the KKK and others. But at the same time, some people expressed concern about potential violations of free speech or a right to public assembly that might come from denying these groups, for example, a permit to hold a rally or some kind of other public event. People also suggested the need to have our president and other important political leaders speak out and condemn such actions, particularly what we saw in D.C. on the 6th with the storming of the Capitol. And many of you also suggested that there needs to be some kind of harsher measurements and legal crackdown on individuals involved in these kind of activities to send a message that doing that is not acceptable. Now, interestingly, it wasn't part of the case study or the readings, but a few of you also raised the issue in relation to the armed protests and this need to balance Second Amendment gun rights with public safety and protection from possible armed extremist groups. So how do we kind of balance these two tensions, public safety on one hand and individual kind of personal liberties on the other? And that's obviously, a much deeper and important ethical and philosophical question that we didn't get to, but I'm glad to see that some of you raised that. And I think it also speaks to the sort of growing debate we're seeing in this country around guns in general, whether that's from all the mass shootings that were going on right before kind of the COVID outbreak began in the years leading up to that, the growing role of armed militias, whether it's groups storming Washington D.C. or showing up for armed rallies at capitals, or Michigan where we saw militia groups arrested for possible attempts to kidnap and assassinate the governor, Whitmer there. And then also more recently with the new sort of Congress, some members of Congress who feel that they have a right to carry a sidearm with them in the Capitol building and actually into the chambers, and the kind of debates that have emerged around that, whether or not legally no member of Congress is allowed to carry a weapon onto the floor, but some of these new members who feel like they should be able to be armed anywhere and everywhere have been challenging these. So we're seeing this as part of kind of a bigger debate that only kind of in one way touches on some of these issues, but speaks to these larger political questions about political rights and liberties. And then finally, I think it's worth noting, our readings didn't really touch on this, but if you look back to the 1960s and 1970s, and kind of the height of political movements in that period, sort of in the very tail end of the civil rights era, you had groups like the Black Panther Party that had emerged in Oakland and other big cities, in part as a response to police actions and targeting of political communities there. And so you started to see, for example, Black Panthers marching in the streets with shotguns, with rifles, and that kind of fear among the white community at that time of these armed kind of black militants out demonstrating actually led to a lot of legislation in the 70s that outlawed guns in, for example, state capitals and other political places. And so there's been kind of a fight since that period to regain some of those, but it's useful to remember that part of the reason that there was a stronger crackdown on sort of, the ability to carry guns anywhere in public in that kind of late 60s, 70s period was actually because of white fears of armed black political activists and individuals. And so now we're seeing kind of an interesting turn now where it's whites who are trying to fight for their right to, be armed in public. And it's both whites and other people of color that are concerned about these kind of white extremists having weapons in public. So we're seeing kind of a shift of a different moment around politics and guns in America. And then you can also see this now with interesting examples like hip hop artist Killer Mike, who's been a big advocate for black self-defense, and has worked with the NRA and other groups to kind of encourage black community members to go out and buy guns and learn self-defense training and shooting practice. So they are also kind of part of this broader debate about guns and race in America. So I thought that was an interesting issue that a couple of you raised that connects with a lot of other topics we've been talking about, even though our readings didn't explicitly get into that kind of issue. Now, on this question of moral obligations, many of you felt that whether or not there was a specific moral obligation for whites, there was a lot of skepticism about that claim. Many people felt that kind of everyone, regardless of their racial or ethnic background, should generally have a moral obligation to care about issues of injustice. So most of you felt like whites shouldn't have kind of a different or special kind of moral obligation just because they're white. And some of you even worried that maybe that sounded a bit too much like reparations, that somehow white people need to be acting differently today because of sort of these histories of racial injustice in the past. And there was some kind of hesitancy to support that argument. But a few of you also felt like there is or should be a different moral obligation for whites to issues of racial justice, and that there should or is kind of a different set of responsibilities to be more actively engaged in anti-racism and racial justice work. For some people, they felt that, if we think about the way that white privilege and institutional racism continues to work today, whites continue to benefit from that, so we have a greater obligation to try to undo these kind of structural inequities that prevent people of color from having equal access and opportunities solely because of their racial or ethnic background. And some people also mentioned that it's important for whites to be sort of more actively engaged in these issues, because if they aren't, then what happens is that's left up to people of color to advocate for their own kind of racial liberation, but it also leaves space for white supremacists to step in and kind of speak for white people, and to maybe even push back against some of these arguments about the necessity for racial justice in America. So a few different reasons why people felt that maybe there was a different, or should be a different set of expectations for whites in racial justice work. Now, another interesting point that people brought up had to do with maybe there's not different ethical obligations for whites or blacks or Latinos or Asian Americans or indigenous communities. We should all be contributing to it, but it might be important for white people to pay more attention to actively trying to cultivate and build more racially diverse, racially just spaces, both as a way to show a commitment to these kind of broader ideas that we are all equal, but also to play more of an active role in helping to foster and create those spaces. So not that we might have different obligations as members of a white community to do something differently, but maybe we have an equal but strong obligation to actively be involved in trying to make kind of a more just community and more address issues of racial justice more consciously. Now, on this question of how should we respond to police brutality, particularly kind of what seems to be a repeating pattern of mostly white officers targeting black and Latino individuals, a number of different options people mentioned: stronger enforcement of things like wearing, not just wearing body cameras, but actually having them on and recording. Stiffer penalties for police officers that do break the law, and much more aggressive prosecution of those cases. And this gets into kind of a long history where police have essential immunities from prosecution in order to kind of protect them from doing their job, so that if a police officer kills someone in the sort of the line of duty, they're not automatically opened up to lawsuits just because they killed someone. And a lot of the kind of debates around policing reform and criminal justice reform in the past year or two have really focused on rethinking those kind of questions, because it's made it very hard to prosecute individuals, even when there's clear evidence on photo or video or audio recording showing that there was a wrongful death involved and there was a homicide case. So how do we kind of bring those kind of discussions to the forefront was something was also raised. A lot of people mentioned better vetting and background checks of people both that are being trained in law enforcement and active law enforcement members. And we've seen this problem in the aftermath of the January 6th insurrection in D.C., where we're finding out that there were a lot of both active duty and former police officers, military, and other law enforcement officials that were part of the group that were involved in breaking into the Capitol and attacking, sometimes actually attacking other police officers and other individuals. So how do we be more aware of sort of who we're putting into these positions of power and authority? Some people also mentioned the need for more sort of training and intervention, sort of nonviolent interventions, conflict resolution, mediation training, so that lethal force doesn't become kind of the immediate default go-to solution in a possible escalating situation. And then people also mentioned that we need to try to address these issues earlier on, so maybe thinking even about how do we reform police academies and the training that young cadets would be getting before they're even being out assigned to patrol duty. Other issues that people raised as being important beyond these kind of police reforms was broadly the role of kind of civic engagement in politics. So, people mentioning that it's important to continue to take part in public demonstrations against police brutality and to help, keep pushing for issues of police reform and criminal justice reform more broadly. Another way people suggested we can help do that is by contacting our elected officials and letting them know that we support, criminal justice reform and police reforms so that they feel like they have the mandate from their electorate. And then finally, writing letters to local newspapers or to other media, or maybe even writing articles that will help kind of raise and continue this kind of broader public discussion about what needs to be done and some of the challenges and some of the possible opportunities. For the second part of the case study, looking at sort of questions of intersectionality and ethical action, in terms of how sort of we as individuals and our own kind of backgrounds and identities connect to these issues, there are a range of different responses. Some of you noted that kind of what we're seeing now is an important reminder that we need to both learn our own sort of history and avoid making sort of those mistakes that we've learned about from the past so that we're not repeating errors from earlier generations. Some of you also talked about feeling that there has to be some kind of a duty involved to do anti-racism work for white individuals, and this goes back to the earlier question about whether or not we do or don't or should or shouldn't have some kind of unique moral obligations for those of you that identify as white addressing these kind of issues. Others said that, they didn't really see any connection between their own self and their identity and these broader issues, so really they didn't have anything to do with them, but they still kind of noted that they in general were opposed to racism, so that was kind of the way they connected to that question. In terms of how we deal with some of these conflicting ethical systems, there were a whole range of different opinions on how to do this. Some people suggested we need kind of a neutral third party that could come in and essentially help mediate some of these ethically polarized debates. Now, it's not clear exactly how we would do that, but that was a suggestion that a couple people raised. Others suggested that money really is at the heart of some of these problems, and people's ethics are actually less the issue, and it's more about kind of money and power, but ethics is kind of how we're framing some of those questions. Others suggested that there are some ethical questions that you will never really be able to solve, and so the best solution is just to kind of put the question to voters through different legislative policies and let the voters decide what they think is or isn't the best course of action. A few of you mentioned the kind of dangers of mob mentality, and also that it's very easy for people who might normally be ethical to kind of either ignore or kind of fudge those ethical commitments in sort of a heated moment when they're with a large group of people that all are kind of pushing in a particular direction. So we might imagine, if you think about all the people that broke into the Capitol in the recent incident, if we took each one of those individuals aside and talked to them about ethics, we might get a very different perspective of what and how they think about the world that might not jive with the way we saw them as kind of this mob invading the Capitol. So how do we kind of disentangle our individual ethics and the way they sometimes get muddied when we're suddenly part of a much bigger group. Others talked about strategies to kind of highlight ethical contradictions in these debates. So when it's clear that someone's saying they believe something but their actions don't reflect that, calling attention to that gap between what people profess and what they're actually doing, and using that both as a way to possibly shame people into trying to actually act the way they claim they believe instead of pretending to claim one thing and doing something different, but also as a way to kind of call attention to this gap between what we think we should be doing and what we are doing, and then using that as a point of conversation and discussion to figure out, well, how do we get closer to living to that ideal we have instead of just saying that's what we believe but not necessarily doing it. And that gets to the last point, which is many of you suggested that one solution to some of these ethical challenges is that we just need to have more dialogue as a public. I mean, it's obviously something at college, you're being exposed to more people, new, different ideas. And so there's this kind of tension where you both have the opportunity to expand and think and be exposed to a lot of new ideas, but people are also maybe hesitant or cautious to really say what they think because, again, going back to this issue of sort of peer pressure and peer mentalities, and maybe it's easier to really not talk about the way you feel and just kind of go with the flow, as it were. And this gets to this next point about some of the obstacles to acting ethically, and a number of different issues were raised here. So many of you talked about the importance of sort of our own family and upbringing and how much of a role that plays in shaping how we think about ethics and our kind of ethical actions. Some of you mentioned the role of stereotypes and how that can be kind of a big obstacle to overcome. Because if we've grown up and been taught that people are a certain way or that only a certain way is right, then we're more likely to share that kind of view. Others mentioned the tendency that when some kind of deeply held view of ours gets challenged and we're proved to be wrong, many of us may resist kind of acknowledging that we're wrong and that maybe we need to rethink our own position. It's easier just to kind of resist admitting that we're wrong and even just perhaps denying the claims that others make, even if we can somewhere in our mind acknowledge that maybe our view is wrong, but we just aren't willing to admit that publicly, because that might mean challenging some core part of who we think we are or something that we believe. Others mentioned the lack of role models could be another challenge. So if we don't have other people around us, whether it's in our immediate family or in our kind of larger social circle, if we don't have people that are talking about issues of racial injustice and how to address them and why they matter, then it's much easier for us to not think and care about them as well. People also mentioned the kind of the power of not just stereotypes, but also fears that keep people from acting differently. So I don't want to be perceived as kind of the outcast in my social group. So if something's happening that maybe I don't agree with, it's easier for me just to not say anything than to kind of put my neck out there and possibly, lose friends or be criticized or have people change their opinions of us. And then this gets to the last point there, which is sometimes we actually act unethically just because we're not acting, because we feel like it's easier to do nothing and just kind of passively observe than it is to actually put the hard work into trying to always be and act ethically. And so our default may be to act unethically, not because we really want to, but because it's the easier thing to do in certain situations. And then on this final question about can someone with a white supremacist kind of perspective also be ethical, almost all of you said no, and that there was a really strong divide between acting ethically and holding white supremacist views. So most of you couldn't find a way to reconcile the two of those. And if we think, so this gets us to a deeper problem. If you look at various research and survey about white supremacist beliefs over the last 5 or 6 years, there's estimates that perhaps 10 to 15% of the American public shares at least some white supremacist views. So if that's the case, how do we respond to thinking that 10 to 15% of America is effectively unethical? If you think you can't both hold white supremacist views and act ethically. So what do we do with all these unethical Americans? How should we engage and interact with them and think about this kind of challenge? Others raised the issue that we read about early on of kind of ethical subjectivity. So maybe within the mindset of a white supremacist, they believe their kind of actions and the way they view the world is framed by a certain ethic, and they may see what they're doing as kind of ethical, but others on the outside obviously would look at that and say, well, that's certainly not ethical. So how do we wrestle with that kind of question of the ethical subjectivity? And this goes back right to earlier discussions about Kant and Hume and others and the search for some kind of a universal or categorical imperative, as Kant called it, that would help us distinguish basic ethical guidelines that would not be subjective in the way we're thinking about here. And then finally, someone else wondered, is it possible that certain white supremacist views could be ethically accepted but not others? And unfortunately, the comments here, there wasn't enough detail to be able to tell what part of those views might be ethically acceptable and which ones aren't, and how we would go about distinguishing those. So that's something that I can't really speculate on, but just wanted to touch on because it was raised in people's comments. So that's just a few of the different issues that we talked about and that were raised in your comments this week on our final Ethics in Action case studies. So I just wanted to highlight and touch on those for all of us. Okay, thanks everybody. It's been an exciting 3 weeks, and I've looked forward to reading all of your comments, and I thank you for all of your engagements with these questions. And I wish you a good start to your spring semester. Okay, bye everybody.